I'm Renee McGregor. I am a sports dietitian that specialises in RED, eating disorders, female health and athlete health and performance. And you are listening to the Physical Performance Show.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Polar's world-leading GPS watches and heart rate monitors. I'm Brad Beer, sports and exercise physiotherapist and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this across a range of our different episodes: Coaches' Corners, Interest Editions, Learnings Catch-Up episodes, Featured Performers, and Expert Editions. Today, you are in for a real treat. We recently hosted a 3-hour live stream event, Fueling the Endurance Athlete, presented by acclaimed UK-based sports dietitian and author and former guest of the Physical Performance Show, Renee McGregor. And it was a huge success with many learnings taken from all live stream participants. Now, as always with our live stream events, the Q&A section presents a fantastic opportunity for the exchange of information specific to people's needs. And on today's episode, you'll hear and glean from some of the wonderful questions that Renee received during the Fueling for the Endurance Athlete live stream. In addition to the many learnings I'm sure you'll take from today's episode, if you'd like to capture the full live stream material, we've now made that available by way of a post-event recording. If you jump over to our bio link on our Instagram gallery, you'll find tickets there, or simply search Renee McGregor live stream over on Google. Now, of course, the other way to avail yourself of the learnings from our live stream events, including Renee's and our former live streams featuring Dr. Stephen Seiler and Dr. Shona Halson, is to consider becoming a Patreon supporter of the Physical Performance Show, where from just $5 per month, we'll grant you complimentary access to our back catalogue of live stream events. So get your pen and paper ready. There are plenty of learnings to be had for coaches, athletes, and practitioners in the field with this Q&A around Fueling the Endurance Athlete with UK-based sports dietitian and acclaimed author, Renee McGregor.
Bodies are really complicated. It's not as simple as just energy in, energy out. And it's not as simple as I want to achieve X, so I'm going to do Y. Because as you've seen, all the biological systems within the body interact and they all work on feedback loops. So if you disrupt one, you're more likely going to disrupt another one. We also can't remove the fact that the body and mind are connected. So again, if you impact something physically, it could have an effect psychologically and also the other way around. If you start to affect somebody psychologically, that can affect them physically. So it's really important to understand those connections. And I guess the last bit of nugget I want to leave you on is, before we go into questions, is human behavior is also not predictable. So while we have lots of sports science and we have lots of information and, often individuals are put in these controlled environments to get the information that we want, that's not real life. So we need to use the sports science 100% to support our practice and to understand our practice. But most of the time, we'll probably be using that information to extrapolate the information. We need to work what is in front of us. We need to respond to what is in front of us. And that's a bit of an art form. But I think, good practitioners get that and they don't just kind of stick with the textbook that, okay, well, it says you need 60 grams of carbs, so that's what you've got to have. It's actually working with that individual and working out why that's challenging for them or why that's not appropriate for them, and then providing them with the practical information that they need alongside.
Renee, firstly, thank you. That was a fantastic session full of, once again, many great takeaways. whether we're coaches, practitioners in the field, athletes of any level, it's all applicable. I feel maybe we may just keep it running and not have another break. And if it means we finish slightly ahead of the allotted 3 hours, I'm sure no one will mind. This is a great opportunity to get our questions answered. I've got about 3 or 4 I want to throw at Renee, but what we might do now is I'll read the question out, Renee, and if you're happy to answer, and we'll work through them systematically from the first ones that we received. Now, we've got some in the Q&A and also some in the chat. I'll just start over in the Q&A and then we'll jump over to the chat. So Susie McMahon, Renee asks or comments, "Hi, Renee. How does carbohydrate availability and fueling change for menopausal women / perimenopausal women still looking to make performance gains in running / triathlon?"
Great question. So what's really interesting is people automatically assume that if you're perimenopausal or postmenopausal, somehow you have to stop eating carbohydrate. Seems to be this kind of link. And when firstly, can I say that the research into perimenopausal and postmenopausal women in sport is pretty scant. There is literally nothing out there. And the reason I say that is because I have done extensive research for my next book, and there's very little information out there. So the information that is available is mainly on healthy postmenopausal women that may be encouraged actually to take up physical activity during this phase, because we know that's actually being physically active can help with some of the symptoms. And the rest of it has actually been through observation through my clinic, because we get a lot of women in perimenopause and postmenopause coming through. So just want to put that out there first, that there is very little information in this area. Probably because, up until recently, it was like your life was over once you went through postmenopause. And this is, again, something to be mindful of in the sense that we know that HRT has become more and more advanced and more available and more accessible, because we're realizing that, women don't just stop at 50 or 55. They continue. They've got another 20, 30 years ahead of them. In order to improve their quality of life, we need to work out what they need. So although our body starts to decline in estrogen, that's because from even an evolutionary point, women did used to kind of, we did have an early mortality rate around that point. But advances in nutrition, advances in science, advances in health have meant that we now live a lot longer, which is why the use of HRT has become so important to continue to help women in these years, in these kind of postmenopausal years. So that's something that's really important. And I guess what most women moan about, or most women struggle with in this period of time, is changes to their body composition, which is why they often immediately go to, I need to remove carbohydrate. And yet that is not the case. So really, although it's tricky, because there will be some changes. We've just seen that, estrogen is really critical in helping us with our body composition. There will be some changes to your body composition and your body shape, perhaps, and there's not much you can really do about that. That is kind of part and parcel of life and changing. But things like taking HRT as early as you can get it can make a big difference. But also, encouraging more resistance training during this period of time is really, really important. We used to say encouraging the resistance training from a bone health point of view, but we're now also finding that it can help with menopausal and perimenopausal symptoms. It can also help with maintaining lean muscle mass, which means you stay more metabolically active, which means that you are less likely to have those body composition changes that occur. So firstly, they're the first two things I would say, is that you need to get on top of, you probably need to start change. I mean, you can still run, you can still do triathlon, but you probably need to emphasize the importance of resistance training during this period of time. And the recommendation is 3 times a week, doing kind of quite big compound movements in the gym. And then, so really then carbohydrate requirements should not change that much. So all the things that we spoke about earlier, they are still as relevant, because if you are still trying to train at that high intensity, if you're still trying to put the effort in and do all those different types of sessions to get the outcome and to be competitive, you still need the carbohydrate to be able to support that training load. So I guess it's kind of taking it stage by stage and working out where you are. I think the hardest bit is the perimenopausal bit, because particularly in the UK, you can't get HRT until you've had a year of no menstruation so that they can classically count you as being menopausal. So the perimenopausal bit is the hardest bit. And there is some research that suggests that you can use things like HRV, so heart rate variability, to train against, which can then sort of help you to know when your body's under stress, when your body's not under stress, and then train accordingly. Because again, one of the biggest symptoms people talk about is fatigue and how tired they get. So actually learning to work alongside your body is really, really important. So I hope that answers that question.
Some really great insights there, Renee. I think anyone that's gaining weight sometimes through changes in their life cycle instinctively often does drop the carbohydrate. We hear about the ills of carbohydrate. So that's some really great information. Thank you. Siobhan, who I believe is a therapist over in Western Australia, asks, Renee, do you tend to see athletes present with weight gain who are in a state of low energy availability, LEA?
Yes, is the answer. Yes. So I probably didn't make that very clear. You don't necessarily need to lose weight with low energy availability. And actually, I would say the majority of people that come into our clinic are probably a normal weight, if not actually maybe a slightly higher body fat percentage than they would expect to be based on the amount of training they're doing. And this comes back to what we said earlier around the downregulation of the metabolic rate, and actually the body holds on to more body fat and holds on to energy because, it's trying to preserve energy. And so we can often see that individuals will hold on to body fat and actually their weight will struggle. They'll keep cutting back because they're like, well, I'm not losing weight. So because we've got this ridiculous notion that we have to be in energy deficit to lose weight. The more they cut back, the more stress their body goes under and the more resistant it becomes. So, there's some really good physiological data, and it shows why diets don't work is because actually when you put a body in a severe energy deficit, the body goes into compensatory behaviors, which is this kind of this kind of down regulation to prevent it, because it doesn't like being in a negative energy balance. But again, because we constantly hear about moving more and eating less, we've all decided that that's what we do.
Brilliant. Renee, Nina asks, asks, I live in a very hot environment and usually do all my runs fasted early in the mornings. I'm struggling with my hormonal cycle, need to recover it, but would like to keep running. What could I do to fuel properly before the morning sessions? How do I avoid fasted runs? Or why are they so, in brackets, bad in my case?
So we know that fasted runs do affect hormonal balance. Fasted training, full stop, basically. It's one of the reasons why we don't recommend it. And even if you are somebody who has a normal hormonal cycle, we would only recommend fasted runs in the way that I described it earlier in the presentation, in that kind of training low aspect, but only probably twice a week max. The reason being is, again, if you think, so in the morning, our cortisol level, our stress hormone is higher than normal, because that's just standard human behavior. But then if you add another level of stress to that by going running, you're basically increasing that cortisol even higher. So you saw the journey of what happens when your cortisol level is very high. It blocks your hypothalamic pituitary axis, and then that will affect your menstrual cycle. To answer Nina's question, it's really tricky because obviously I don't know enough about how severe her situation might be. While we would not always stop people from running. In certain situations, we may have to. And I'm sure she doesn't want to hear that. But the problem is, it's not just about, the thing about recovering from RED-S, it's not just about eating more, which is what people think. Oh, can I maintain this level of activity as long as I just keep eating more? Unfortunately, it's a bit like thinking about, when your bank you go into overdraft into your current account, and you sort of think, okay, well, I'll put more money in, but you never get it back to zero. So you never really get out of your overdraft because you put more money in, but you keep spending at the same time. And really what we have to do is we need to get the body back in the green. So we need to get your bank balance back to zero, then add the excess cash before you can start to spend again. So I know that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it's kind of what we have to do. So sometimes it's not just a case of you need to eat more. Sometimes you do have to modify your training and change your training load. And that doesn't mean you just need to stop running, but it might mean you have to decrease your running and add different types of training. And again, it's very individual. And I would suggest working with somebody who can look at your bloods and see what situation you are in at the moment to give you that concrete advice. But some good tips, and it's what I do before I go running, because I tend to run in the mornings. And like day before, I did a training session and I knew that I definitely needed to take fuel on. I always take fuel on anyway. But what I find is using sports products really helpful at this point. So I'll tend to take a gel before I go out, and I'll usually carry one with me, and I'll have that during my session. Or I might have something like a banana before I go running, or I might have a glass of juice, or I might have some toast. It depends on how long I'm going to go out running for. It depends on what kind of training session it is. If it's a higher intensity stuff, I'll always make sure I have a good amount of energy before I go out. If it's more of an easy run, then I probably just do that on a banana or a glass of juice. But please remember, I am in energy availability, and I do have a normal hormonal cycle. So I am well, and I am, kind of regulated. So again, if you're in a big deficit, it might be that it has to be different.
Thank you, Renee. Renee, questions come through here. Hi, how do you balance not putting on weight and fueling well, i.e. eating more for your level of training? I've been trying to eat more, including the timings, etc., and have been putting on weight, and it's further impacting performance as I'm getting heavier. I'm a marathon and ultra distance runner, plus ocean endurance swimmer. Thanks. P.S. I eat clean and no refined sugar too.
So there's a couple of things there. Like, I think firstly, it sounds like this person is like weight is changing quite consistently. But I think one thing to remember is that there is a weight attached to glycogen stores. So if you're eating better and you're taking on the carbohydrate that you need, you are going to weigh more, because for every gram of carbohydrate we store in every gram of glycogen we store in our muscles, we also store somewhere between 1 and 4 grams of fluid, which is why when you carb load and then you go on to the start of a marathon, you're often a bit heavier, because actually you're holding on to that fluid. So that's the first thing, is it actual weight gain, or is it the fact that you are, is it the fact that actually you're fueling better, so your stores are fuller? And I would normally say that's usually around 2.5 kilos of that is glycogen store. So it's really important to understand that. But if you're still finding that your weight is consistently going up, then it's not about, obviously we said we don't want to put you in a big deficit, but what we have seen is that two things. One is a very small deficit can start to create sustainable weight loss. So we're actually looking at probably no more than 100 to 200 calories a day deficit. That's kind of the absolute max that you'd want to do. So to be honest, that could be that you might increase your energy output by that, and you don't change your nutritional intake, or you reduce your nutritional intake slightly, but I would reduce it from every aspect. Again, people tend to remove the carbohydrate element, but actually what you want to do is remove that through all 3 food groups, so that you're just getting slightly smaller portions, but you're still having the same types of fueling and the same types of food, which is important. The other thing that's really important, I don't know, as a marathon runner and as a ultra runner, I'd hope you would do this, but again, I'll go back to resistance training. Like resistance, because the thing is, even as you lose weight, one of the things we see in why diets don't particularly work is that people do find that the first 6 months they do lose a lot and their body mass changes. But then as your body mass goes down, remember your energy requirements go down, right? The heavier you are, the more you need to a certain degree. So your energy requirements go down. So one of the ways in which you maintain that body weight or that body size is to become more metabolically active, which is where the resistance training comes in, because cardio doesn't really do that for you. So resistance training is, I keep going to go, not that I am I'm not a coach or anything like that, but the benefits of resistance training are becoming very, very clear to all endurance sports. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of us endurance athletes tend to focus on our sport, and we forget about the importance of that resistance training, not just from a body composition point of view, but also from a functional movement point of view, from a efficiency point of view. Like, how many runners, Brad, have you worked with whose glutes don't work? Right? Like, it's really important.
Great stuff there, Renee. Chris asks, and then he comments after that you've answered his question, but I think it's worth just throwing up there in terms of if there's anything extra you might add. Hi, Renee. Thanks for an awesome presentation. What are your thoughts on training the body to more efficiently, in brackets, burn fat, i.e. purposefully training in a carb-depleted state during long, slow runs? Thanks.
Yeah, so like I said, I'm not opposed to it, but I think it's just understanding the limitations and also where it can tip into potentially being problematic. So like I said, a couple of sessions a week, not a problem, as long as you're then taking on the carbohydrate you need afterwards and for the rest of the day. Like that seems to be the important feature. We know that as an endurance athlete, to be honest, you're constantly becoming better at using fat for fuel because of the amount of training you do. Like it's actually quite difficult to keep on top of the amount of carbohydrate your body needs. And so you generally become more efficient at using fat for fuel anyway, just through your training load. But yeah, including 2 sessions a week maximum where you work at that quite low intensity, but for a longer period of time in a carb depleted state is absolutely okay to do, as long as you don't have any previous history of low energy availability, because we find that the body's very sensitive. If you've already had low energy availability, it'll be very sensitive and it can push you back in quite quickly.
You're listening to Renee McGregor on this expert edition, Fueling the Endurance Athlete Q&A, episode 297. Support for today's show comes from Polar. If you are looking for a world-class GPS watch, look no further than Polar's Vantage V2 watch. It's now available in Polar Red, and it is an impressive, beautiful, I'd say, looking watch. It's a pinnacle of sports technology design, offering a whole new style of winning. Polar Vantage V2 watch connects to your music app and lets you control your tunes without having to take your phone out on a session. The nightly recharge recovery measurement shows you how well you recover from the demands of your day during the night. And the leg recovery test tells you whether your legs are ready for high intensity training in just a couple of minutes without any specialist equipment. So if you're looking for your next multi-sport watch, do not go past the beautiful Polar Red Vantage V2. Jump over to polar.com. The team have generously offered up to 15% off selected products by using the code TPPS. Jump over to polar.com. Support for today's show also comes from the Physical Performance Show's very own Learnings membership, where you can become a patron of the show by jumping over to Patreon, patreon.com, and from just $5 per month, you can support the production of the show, and in return, we'll grant you access to our back catalogue and all upcoming live stream events, normally ticketed at $49 per live stream. A huge thank you to this week's new show patron, Jason Kippen. Thank you for your support. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, Renee McGregor, on this expert edition, Fueling the Endurance Athlete Q&A. Renee, I might throw one over from my list and then we'll jump back on the questions there. Something I always find, I guess, challenging working with athletes in my role as a sports physiotherapist, and obviously this is not my field, but is questions around should athletes, if you're educating them, the headlines around these concepts of energy availability, they may ask, should they use an app to track intake, such as for carbohydrate and protein? How do they calculate it so that they don't run the risk of unintentionally potentially being in an energy deficit? But is there a risk then with using things like that because it becomes too calculated and too much of a focus in terms of the risk of things like triggering orthorexia and things? So I guess the question in summary is, how do athletes truly calculate if they have the knowledge of what they need to hit the benchmarks? How do they best calculate that?
Yeah, really great question. I mean, I think you and I know, I am really anti-tracking apps because I see how it impacts the mentality of an athlete. So we didn't really go into that, but, most athletes, I'm not saying all, but most athletes tend to be a certain type of mentality. They tend to be this kind of very perfectionist, sort of driven, motivated individual, this personality type A that we're associated with. And I think, again, just to make it really clear, there's a real difference between perfectionism and driven, right? They're two very separate things, but often they're overlapped and put into one. And again, to be very clear, perfectionism is just, it's an addiction to a set of beliefs that somehow are going to define our worth. So it becomes this obsessive addiction to keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing, that somehow if we keep doing that, it's going to help us define our worth. And that's not a healthy place to be. Whereas being driven, being motivated is different in the sense that, you know, you have that get up and go, you have that drive, you want to improve, but you also have that ability to learn from your failures and mistakes and move forward rather than continually be critical of yourself. So there's something that's really important to understand. So this athlete mentality is quite obsessive. And we know that you have to be obsessive to a certain degree to get where you want to get to. But again, it's learning to manage that obsession so that it doesn't become dysfunctional. With the tracking apps, the issue is that it can feed into this very perfectionism, obsessive personality trait in that, you know, I need to get it right. And I always hear that in clinic, I need to get it right. This absolute need to get it right. Mm. But even with all this information that we have out there, as I said, right at the end of the presentation, humans are not textbooks and humans are complicated. And really, if you are hormonally regulated, if you are in alignment with your body, which we all are born with, we've already seen that physiologically, humans are biologically biased to achieving energy balance. So your body is going to tell you, like, how many of you notice if you suddenly do more exercise, surprise, surprise, you feel more hungry, right? That's just normal. So actually using your appetite as guidance is really what we're encouraging people to do. But within that framework of knowing that you need to take on carbohydrate, you need the protein and the carbohydrate in that recovery process. So you understand the fundamentals, and then you start working out what that looks like for you. And some of that is just trial and error. And also it'll be different each time. Like there are some days where my normal portion of pasta is just not enough and I want more. And I don't want to be restricted by the fact that, I've said I need to only have this many grams of carbohydrates of that. Because if my body is telling me it wants more, then that's an indicator that somewhere along the line I've maybe not had enough, or I've done a bit more. Maybe I've run up and down the stairs a bit more than I normally do because I've been busy or whatever. And I need that. So I think it's like, it's difficult because humans, again, find uncertainty very, very difficult. And when we don't have that absolute, our brains go into sort of default mode of trying to find the answers from within ourselves. And this is where then it can be that we tend to go into what we call a definitive negative, because it's much easier to hold on to a definitive negative than it is to sit in the I don't know. And especially an athlete where you're very outcome focused and very numbers focused, it's very easy to go, well, how many numbers do I need? What is it? What is that? But it's really, as a practitioner, you can give guidance and you can give guidelines, but you can't give absolute because everybody is going to be slightly different. And I think, Louise Burke, I said, put it really well. It's always going to be a ballpark, and it's working with that person, understanding how that person's body works, that is going to be really important. Tracking apps are not my favorite thing because I think they put you into a false sense of security and can also lead to quite poor behaviors, in the sense that you can become very, very focused on what you should and shouldn't have. And it means that you then potentially could miss out on social events and eating with friends and family. And, let's not move away from the fact that even as an athlete, your well-being is really critical. And we only get well-being when we make connections with people. Humans are social individuals. They need social interaction. If nothing else, the pandemic has shown us that. Mental health issues have never been so bad. And we know that that's been driven by the pandemic and this whole lockdown and being isolated. So connection and human connection is really important. And even if you are a very motivated, driven individual who has an absolute goal that you want to achieve, in order to be a balanced individual, you need to balance all those different human needs that we have, right? So physical needs, yes, warmth, water, food, roof over our head. but we mustn't forget the emotional needs that we have as well. And you can't really be balanced if you don't have those emotional needs. Food is complicated. It's not just as simple as fuel in, fuel out. It has so much more meaning to most of us. And we mustn't forget that. So I guess what I'm saying is, with the people I work with, I will always give guidance. I'll always say, you need to make sure you're having these sort of suggestions around breakfast or leading into a session. And these are the kind of good things to have for recovery. But in terms of the quantities and volumes, you sort of have to work that out yourself. And generally speaking, if you get it right, you can perform well, you'll see progression, you'll recover well, you'll be sleeping well, you'll feel good, you'll have enough energy, your mood will be good, your menstrual cycle will be healthy, your morning erectile function will be healthy. You know all the signs of when you're feeling good. But if you're constantly fatigued, if you're not training well, if you're not seeing adaptation, if you're not recovering, you're getting more muscle soreness, probably an indicator you're not quite getting it right. And you use that information to then change it.
So look to more the secondary indicators of performance and health versus ongoing need to calculate and monitor.
Yeah. And it's a really difficult concept for a lot of people, a very difficult concept, but it is probably the best way. If you look at people who do get it right, they don't think about it 24 hours a day. They respond to what their body wants, and that's what they do.
I guess some of it I observe is a fear and an anxiety, and I can relate to this with the sequelae of bone stress injuries with my running and triathlon over the years, where you fear that you're in still unintentional energy deficiency and you just want to know if you're getting it right.
That's also where blood tests can be quite useful, because that can help. I recently was worried about that just because I was in quite a big training block. I had a really big race, one of the hardest races I've ever done in September. And I was in quite a big training block, plus my work schedule, plus life challenges. And I was a bit a couple of symptoms. And I was like, is this just because I'm just a bit tired, I'm not recovering well, or is there something else going on? And so I just did some blood tests. And actually my blood test indicated that I was fine. And it was just that I was tired from life. Which was fine, because it still gave me something to go and work on. It still was like, right, okay, well, actually, if this is affecting your training, then you need to put some real concrete time in to have some rest and do non-training things as well. So, and non-work things as well. So I think I personally find blood tests really helpful. Because they can give you that absolute data.
And there's a question here about blood work, Rennie, so it's a good time to ask. Is there a schedule for blood work or a yearly rhythm, or as needed? Anything you'd suggest?
Generally speaking, in an ideal world, I would probably try and test people 3-4 times a year, generally speaking. That said, I think a really good thing is, if you're doing a major race, and this sort of still fits in about 3 or 4 times a year, if you're doing a big race, then it's probably quite useful to do blood race in that period where you're then starting to maybe think about rebuilding back up for your next event or your next, training block. Because as I said, you can then identify if somebody has recovered sufficiently or not. Because if let's say their CPK, the inflammatory markers are a little bit high still, you can go, do you know what? I'd give it another week, because if you go into another training block now, potentially you're going to put yourself at risk of injury. So just give it another week and we can have a look at that. So in terms of rhythm, yes, sometimes I'll sort of say, let's just check. But I suppose 3-4 times a year is probably enough. Unless, of course, you've got somebody who is in reds and you want to check. But even with them, I wouldn't check their hormonal status more frequently than every 2 to 3 months, to be honest, because you're not going to see big changes in a month, fundamentally. It's going to take, the body does need 6 to 8 weeks before it starts to respond to any changes.
Thanks, Rennie. Rennie, Grant asks, how many calories or grams of carbohydrate under the required daily energy intake would one need to be in order to be considered in the red zone, in the red S zone?
So the standard, what they say is that 35 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, so per body weight of fat-free mass, seems to be the lower threshold. That said, there are some studies coming through that are showing that actually in some people it could be 40. For some people it could be 45. Again, it's sort of it is very individual. And I think rather than focusing on the number again, I would be looking at the secondary responses and what's going on. Like you can tell when you can start to pick up the signs when you're in reds. And I think if you even have, it's like somebody messaged me this morning saying, can you get depression with reds? Yes. Although hormonal cycle might be the first thing to go in most cases, it's not the only thing. When I had reds, which was quite a long time ago, my cycle didn't stop, but my recovery was really poor. And actually I ended up with more autoimmune responses. So I ended up with, more autoimmune issues. So it's not always going to be hormonal. Sometimes it's immune function, sometimes it's digestive health, sometimes it's going to be more injuries. So if you're getting recurrent soft tissue injuries, something really big for the physios out there, like if someone's coming in with consistent soft injury, tendon, these are probably indicators that there is low energy availability going on. It's not just it's not just a repetitive strain injury. Why are you getting that? There's always a reason why somebody's getting injured. And again, you're the expert here, Brad, but I was talking to physio yesterday at ballet and I said, biomechanical loading is probably quite low on the causes of injury in general. Most of the time it is the under recovery and the under fueling that creates the injury, I'd say.
I'd absolutely agree, particularly with bone in distance runners and that community. Renee, you use the term fat-free mass, and a good question there is, what are the best ways for an athlete to discover their fat-free mass? And is it important for the athlete to know that figure exactly?
So again, it comes back to if you want to be absolute about things or not. Like we use skin folds. In ballet, we do use it because it's very, very helpful to us to find out, mainly because we don't want people to go too low from a fat-free mass perspective. So we do use skin folds. We use a sum of 7. And I think that's, if you've got a practitioner that's been trained up appropriately, in the UK, we call it the ISAC qualifications. It's probably the same in Australia as well. But if you've got somebody that can do that and they can consistently do that within that sport, then that's probably the bet, or the same practitioner can do it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, a nutritionist. It could be a physio, it could be a strength and conditioning coach, but somebody who can do it consistently, because there's always going to be a slight error. You're going to have a slight percentage of error each time you do it. But if the same person does it, you're more likely to get a decrease in that. So skin folds is the most simplest and probably one of the most reliable. There's a lot of bioimpedance scales and things, but I don't rate those. I've not found one that is particularly reliable. It does seem to be affected by fluid balance quite a lot and hydration and dehydration. DEXA is the gold standard, but again, not everybody's got access to a DEXA and it's quite expensive, so often it's not used. I've seen it being used in big football clubs in the UK, but they've got the money to do so they can. And then in some places, in some universities, they are using something called the bod pod, which again gives you quite a good caliber. What I'm saying is, however you calibrate it, it's making sure you use the same process so that you get the trend and you get that crude value. I think you can get quite good as a practitioner. I think you can get quite good at estimating, because when you've worked with enough athletes, you can kind of go, 20%, 18%. You can kind of work it out. But obviously that's not saying that that's particularly useful for everybody. But even if it's a crude value, you can kind of start to use that. You get that. Like if you know that you're sort of looking at a female athlete, for example, and they have got a menstrual cycle. Chances are, if they've got a menstrual cycle, they're not going to be below 18%, right? So you know that straight off, generally speaking. So you can go, okay, they're probably somewhere between 18 and 20% because they still look really lean, and there's nothing kind of there's no excess there. So you can kind of go probably, and then you can roughly work out then what that looks like. So if they're 56 kilos, you work out 80% of 56 kilos, and that's the number then that you times up by the calorie value. But I will always say this is all rough estimates, because again, everybody is different, and we don't, these again are ballpark figures. Some people might be 37 calories per kilogram of body weight. We've used an estimate, an average.
Renee, Chris from Sydney, Australia asks, I've heard on the Physical Performance Show, it's said before that appetite is not a good indicator of energy availability. At what point does Renee think that appetite can no longer be used as a good guidance of energy intake, if at any time?
So it's a really good point. When we've done hard training, like really hard, intense training, often our appetite goes. And he's 100% right. So that at that point, it can't be used as a good indicator. And this is where sometimes the problems start, because after a hard training session, if you don't have an appetite, you then don't eat. That can then become your behavior, right? But what people don't always appreciate is that there's generally a lag phase. So I don't know if you think about races and events you do. If I've done a long running session on a Sunday, I might not feel hungry Sunday, but come Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm ravenous because my body's trying to make up that energy deficit. So I guess if you continually ignore hunger cues, or you're continually working too hard that you don't identify those hunger cues, then appetite is not a good indicator. And and I think this is why when I work with athletes, and they often say, "Oh, I don't feel like having breakfast in the morning," or after my training session, I really struggle to take on energy. And I go, okay, well, in that case, mechanically, you have to take on something. Like, it's that mechanical eating aspect of having to do it. Because if you know that your appetite goes off when you do a lot of hard training, but you also know that recovery is really critical, you just do it. You don't hesitate, you just do it. So it's a really interesting question what you asked, because there is an element of, yes, sometimes you just have to do what you know you need to do. And sometimes actually you have to listen a little bit more, because what you've done in that first instance, in terms of that recovery window, is going to be great in terms of helping with that immediate recovery process. But probably your body's still going to be trying to catch up. Again, what people don't realize is that it takes up to 72 hours for our bodies to catch up after hard training. Okay. So it is common to feel hungry 3 days after you've done a hard session. That is normal. But again, I think people get worried about that and don't feel that that's appropriate. And so then they ignore it. And then that's where you start blunting your appetite response.
Thank you, Renee. Renee, Grant asks a continuation there. If an athlete is classified, I guess, as having RED-S, how quickly will a corrected and appropriate diet correct this, days, weeks, or months?
Depends on the individual and how far they are. So as we were saying, if you've got somebody that is in involuntary REDs, it's become accidental REDs, we've identified it quickly enough, you can usually rectify it within 8 to 12 weeks. If you've got somebody who is a lot more entrenched in their behaviors and has been in low energy availability for a very long period of time, you're probably looking more like months. And in some cases, it can be years as well. It does depend on the presentation.
Jamie asks a couple of questions regarding male energy availability. In an example relating to morning erectile function monitoring, if this is less than optimal but can be restored quickly with increased energy intake without training modifications, would you assume this is a minor issue to monitor and address without being a RED-S issue?
Possibly, yes, because it is, we can't forget that your erectile function is not just related to energy availability. It might be poor sleep. It could be stress, like psychological stress as well. So I definitely say that as an indicator that you may have addressed it. But I suppose just to check, it's not a bad idea just to get a testosterone test just to see. And fundamentally, what we normally expect in endurance athletes, a healthy figure for an endurance athlete would be in the sort of late teens. So you'd expect that would be okay. Most healthy males would be in the 20s or above. The problem is when it starts to get into when you start to get into 10 and into single figures, that's where it's becoming really worrying. And that's where, but as I said, you don't always pick that up just through symptoms, which is why by the time it gets to that stage, you will have picked it up through symptoms. But if we can catch it on the decline, we can avoid that from happening. An extension of that, Renee, from Jamie's question there, there's a part 2 there, would be the effect of the aging male whose erectile morning function will tend to decrease. How does that then modify the recommendation of 5 morning erections a week? So again, really good question. And actually what's interesting is that 40% of male athletes as they get older may actually develop testosterone deficiency. So that is something to definitely consider. If you want to compete, if you want to continue to compete, obviously you mustn't take additional testosterone because it's banned. And that's very, very clear that it's not recommended. Again, the evidence would suggest doing the lean muscle, so improving your lean muscle mass, so maintaining resistance training and keeping a level of high intensity load within your training seems to help with maintaining testosterone levels, but only if you're meeting your energy requirements. So it's that kind of balance again. It is a really tricky one. And I guess if I'm honest, so far in our clinic, we've probably only had one individual who fits that. But to be fair, when we've done the clinical questioning around that, so he was an older athlete, his testosterone was low. But it could have been age, quite right. But equally, it could have been REDS. And when we did the clinical questioning around his behaviors and how much he was eating and what was going on in his life, it was really obvious he was REDS. So I think it's, like I said, the blood tests and the values and the signs are all important, but it's pulling that whole picture together that really is critical. And it's often what's missing. Like you'll have practitioners who'll pick on one thing, but they may not do the full questioning, which is where, like, a lot of women get fobbed off with PCOS. Well, it's because the specialist involved is not asking those questions around what is going on from a diet history, from a training history, that kind of thing.
Renee, Jamie, thank you. Jamie, continuation there in the question was also, is there commonly individuals who require, assuming due to something like resting metabolic rates, volumes in excess of the suggested energy intakes to achieve energy balance?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Physiologically, we have different, I would say, genotypes and phenotypes. And some people do need a higher intake. There is no doubt about it, which is why we can't just have this one number fits all, because different body types are going to need different amounts. But again, it's working with that individual, getting as much information as you can. Information is your friend, right? Getting as much information as you can, and then directing and guiding is what makes you a good practitioner.
You're listening to Renee McGregor on this expert edition, where you can glean learnings from some of the Q&A session extracted from the recent Fueling the Endurance Athlete live stream, now available for post-event purchase or by becoming a Patreon supporter of the show. Now, on the topic of fueling, I recently caught up with co-founder of Precision Hydration, Andy Blow, back on episode 290, where Andy discussed the importance of athletes knowing their 3 levers: how much fluid they need, carbohydrate that they require, and the sodium that they need to replenish through their exercise sessions and races. It was a very popular expert edition, and I recently caught up with Andy to discuss some of the great new innovations that Precision Hydration are offering athletes, coaches, and practitioners to help strip away the mystery around athletes knowing their numbers. So Andy, the team are pressing on with some great innovations in the space. It's your competitive advantage, and that is the ability to really help athletes dial in their fueling and hydration strategies. And you've just released some really interesting and insightful case studies on the precisionhydration.com site.
Yeah, Brad, it's been a great project this last year, because what athletes want to know is how much fluid, how much sodium, how much carbohydrate they need to take in per hour. And we know from all the studies we've done, we know from all the scientific evidence out there that those numbers are quite varied between individuals. So what we've been working hard to do is pull together a bunch of case studies for athletes across a range of endurance sports, triathlon, running, cycling, swimming, to see how much fluid, how much sodium, how much carbohydrate are people taking in per hour, and then how successful they've been in their events. And the idea with these case studies isn't that they're up there for people to copy, but they're to get your head around the numbers that might work for you and to give you a platform to build on. And then in conjunction with the tools that we've got on the website, like the online sweat test, the quick carb calculator, you can dive in and use those tools to get your numbers sorted out and start that trial and error process to see how much fluid, how much sodium, how much carb is going to work for you when you're out there competing in the summer heat.
Thanks, Andy. And if you happen to miss episode 290, knowing your numbers, do jump back. It was an expert edition full of learn-ins. And do take advantage of your first Precision Hydration order by using the code TPPS15 for 15% off your first order over at precisionhydration.com of their electrolytes or their all-new fuel range. Questions coming through here, Rennie. I've had a plateau in training, 50-kilometre ultra runner, feeling tired all the time and tests showing low iron. It's been an ongoing thing for the past 10 years. I'm currently 1 year postpartum and breastfeeding. Menstrual cycle has just come back. How do I find out if this is due to low intake in calories, red S, or gut digestion issues? Feel like I'm never getting to the root cause to improve it. If red S, how long does it take to recover from approximately, which I know you've just touched on?
That's quite a complicated presentation because you've got breastfeeding in there, which is going to be energy utilizing. You've got low iron levels, which again is going to affect performance. You've got a new mum, which we all know is exhausting. New parent is exhausting, full stop. I guess where I would go with that is I would probably do a full assessment of nutritional intake versus energy output. I think that's where you'd need to start, just to check. And also looking at, how much iron is being taken. And if this is an individual that has been given iron supplements in the past, has that worked? Has that not worked? Like, these are quite, big questions. Asking questions around bowel health and gut health, there's no way of testing the microbiome at the moment at all. But again, you can kind of identify through questioning around stool health, gut health, etc. The fact that her menstruation has just returned is a good sign. Like, it would suggest that balance is returning. But I think it would still be useful to understand what her fueling is like around training particularly, and also what her intake of iron is, and appreciating that also some people are just very prone to low iron levels because the way in which they foot strike means they break down more red blood cells anyway. So I guess it's not a very clear answer, I suppose, but I would say probably needs someone to do a full assessment of her whole lifestyle and training and intake, just to check the balance there.
Thank you, Rennie. Rennie, question has come through. How can you differentiate between red S and overtraining syndrome?
So there's some really good stuff coming out from, I think I can never say his name properly. Is it Trent Stellingworth. Yeah. And he has just recently shown there's a real overlap between the two. And actually it's probably one and the same thing to a certain degree. So I think you can't is the answer. Because if you're overtraining, then likelihood is that you're not providing your body with enough energy to do that training load, right? So it's kind of chicken and egg a little bit. But I guess the big difference again is we're really like pulling hairs here, but the big difference is that with the overtraining, maybe the rest element and the recovery element is the problem, is that there's just not enough rest and recovery between training, between competitions. There's kind of excessive need to keep moving and to keep pushing, and maybe too many higher intensity sessions as well. Like, I think that's one of the things that we do see is that people feel like they have to do this kind of high intensity work all the time rather than periodizing their training through the week and getting the kind of real mix of aerobic versus low aerobic versus anaerobic training that is what's going to make you a better athlete. So it's a very difficult one to differentiate. I guess there is this big overlap, and I think you're probably treating more or less the same situation.
Jackie asked, Rennie, can you give an idea of how nutrition may need to be varied depending on the time in the menstruation, on time in menstrual cycle? So
we don't have any absolute data. Like, I think that's something to make very, very clear. We see trends, and that's important. Like, we see trends that, generally speaking, in the follicular phase, the first half of our cycle, we are a lot more balanced, and we tend to be able to use a lot more fat for fuel. So we're a bit more stable, and we probably don't notice these big blood fluctuations. However, as I said earlier, that mid-follicular phase is really critical in getting the kind of training, the nutrition right. So kind of ensuring sufficient carbohydrate around your training. But what I'm trying to say is you may find that in this follicular phase, you can push your body a little bit harder because you're able to use fat a lot more efficiently. But that doesn't mean you should be avoiding carbohydrate. That's still really, really important, as we saw from how it affects leptin levels. So that's really, really important. What we do know is that for a lot of women in the post-follicular phase, so in the luteal phase, this is where, so in the post-ovulatory phase, this is where often fluctuations occur. And we know that when progesterone is dominant, it starts to have an effect on sort of core temperature. It can have an effect on your cardiac output. It can have an effect on hydration and on blood sugars. And there does seem to be a suggestion that we need a lot more carbohydrate in this second half of the cycle. So, I find often that where I'm in the follicular phase, I can do an easy session on a banana. In the luteal phase, that often is not enough. I often find that I still feel quite shaky if I go out running on just a banana. So I have to consider what else I need to have with me. The best way to identify is to track your cycle and track your symptoms, because we're all different. So some women will find that actually the first 2 or 3 days of their cycle is when they feel at their worst, and that's a really bad time to do any sort of hard training. Whereas other women might find that that's a really good time to do training. So I notice for me that I find that sort of just around before I ovulate and into ovulation is probably my best time to train. But that's something I have tracked myself and noticed. That is not to say that all women are going to be the same. That's what I have noticed in myself. So I think tracking your cycle is really important. If you have a coach, talking through that with your coach, like I talk to my coach about my cycle and what that looks like. And then he's adjusted my intake. He's adjusted my training accordingly. So actually we work on this is just to give you some information on what I do. We work on a 2 week on, 2 week off, because I find that there are 2 weeks in the month where I can train really hard and I can push really hard. But then there are 2 weeks where even if he puts a session in there, I just can't quite meet the criteria. So we tend to do 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and that works for me. But then, other women will do 3 weeks on, 1 week off, and so on and so on. So it will be different depending on you.
Jackie asks, Renee, can you elaborate on different fueling needs, particularly throughout adolescence?
Wow, that's quite a big topic to cover. I suppose, I guess with adolescents, the key things to be thinking about is obviously you're supporting growth as well as their training. So you definitely need to think about ensuring sufficient energy requirements. Bone health is absolutely key focus in that, we know that by adolescence, 90% of our bone density has been put down. So really ensuring good bone health practices. So calcium intake is going to be critical in that. Vitamin D is going to be critical in that. Protein, energy, these are all really, really important. So those are kind of really important. I think with adolescents, sometimes it can be difficult to get their requirements just through meals. So they may need more frequent fueling. So they may need much more of that kind of 3 meals, 3 snack approach, particularly if they're going through growth phases. And again, particularly with female adolescents, keeping that focus on iron and iron intake, particularly as they start their menstrual cycle, that's going to be important as well. So those would be the key things. I mean, that's that's a whole subject on its own, but they would be the key things I'd be focusing on.
Brilliant. Renee, Cam asks, hi, Renee, my partner hasn't had a period in 12 plus months. She's recently had a blood test done where her hormones are within normal ranges, but could you identify at what point would you investigate levels of FSH, LH, estrogen and progesterone, e.g. when FSH is less than 1, etc.?
So I would investigate if someone is presenting with amenorrhea for 12 months, I'm sorry, but those results are not going to be in the normal range. And I get quite frustrated by practitioners that say that, because the problem we have is that with female hormones, they are constantly changing. So often when we look at the standard ranges for FSH, LH, estrogen, for example, they change depending on where you are in your cycle. Now, if you haven't had a cycle and you're measuring numbers, you can't tell where you are. So you can't say that those numbers are normal because you don't know if you're in the follicular phase, the ovulatory phase, or the luteal phase. So it sounds like to me that, you don't have to have FSH, LHs to be less than minus 0.1 or less than 1 to be problematic. If you have FSH and LH values that are mid-range, sort of like 4 or 5s, and estrogens that are lower, so like less than 100 or just around the 100, that is still indicative of low energy availability in reds, because you can't identify where that is in the cycle. So I get frustrated when physicians say your numbers are normal when the individual is presenting with amenorrhea, because actually that cannot be avoided. That cannot. So it would suggest to me that your partner has got hypothalamic amenorrhea from what you've said. Obviously, I don't know without doing more insight, but it would suggest she does. And my advice is go and find a decent endocrinologist who can go through that with you. And you don't take no for an answer, because not having a period for 12 months is going to have a significant effect on many things, including her bone health.
Don't take no for an answer. Powerful advice there, Renee. Renee, there's 2 final questions here. One comes through from Jason, who asks something very interesting. Best way to fuel with athletes who have had gastric bypass and physically cannot eat the amounts of food they should?
Wow, that's a really good question. I don't think I've ever had anybody with gastric bypass in training. So good one. I guess the things you've got to be also aware of is the absorption rate and kind of vitamins and minerals that might be affected, because obviously, we absorb those in different parts of our bowel. So that's something to be aware of. I think in these cases, you probably have to do little and often, and you probably need to think about high nutrient value per gram or per mil of product. So I'd be using quite high energy dense milkshakes and I suppose even maybe using sports drinks, but perhaps concentrating it up a little bit more, but obviously, again, being aware that might have an effect on the gut. So just being mindful of that. But very much that little and often approach, and trying to choose foods that are going to deliver more than just, that they're not low energy, they're quite high energy. So you might have to use more foods that are often seen as unhealthy, but actually deliver the energy without perhaps giving you much else. But as long as you do hit you do get some complex carbohydrate in there, and you get some protein, you get some essential fats, but you may need to supplement with more sort of energy drinks and food groups that are not often associated with being healthy, but actually could be really helpful in this case.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know you enjoyed Renee's share-ins as always. If you're not following Renee McGregor, then do follow her over on Instagram at @R_McGregor. And if you'd like to get your hands on the full learnings from the Fueling the Endurance Athlete live stream, simply Google Renee McGregor live stream or jump over to our Instagram bio, and there you'll find the link. Tickets are $49 per person, including the PDF materials from the live stream. Or become a patron of the show and receive complimentary access to not just Renee's recent live stream, but our back catalogue and all upcoming live stream events. Talking about live stream events, we are planning to shift the learnings to the brain, and our next live stream event will be focusing around the psychology of the athlete. Details soon to be released. Massive thanks as always to the great folk who make this show possible: Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, episode 298, we're fast closing in on our 300th episode. We're keeping the learnings coming your way. We'll share with you a conversation that I recently had with Australian-based physiotherapist and researcher Anthony Nasser around one of the most persistent and frustrating injuries for endurance athletes, and that is proximal hamstring tendinopathy. Now, Anthony is completing his PhD looking at this injury. So next week, if you yourself have struggled with it or you know someone struggling with it, it's an episode not to miss. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.